In the Iron Vein Mountains, the blizzard howls as if it means to swallow the world whole. A towering figure drives through knee-deep drifts, breath tearing against the iron cold. She freezes at the lip of an unseen gully. One massive hand locks around a frozen root and hauls her body back from the drop in a single, desperate pull. Inside the satchel, clenched against her ribs, something heavy shifts with every heartbeat: old paper and gold that has waited decades in the dark. Behind her, boots punch through crusted snow. Two shadows close on the abandoned wagon cabin. The roof groans under wet weight. A rear shutter explodes outward. She plunges into the white dark, toward a rope bridge stretched thin over black emptiness. Each board tested, wind screaming, snow erasing every track. Then the plank beneath her right boot cracks. Ashford Creek did not have a bell big enough to mark the hour Bryda Calder was born. That was the first joke the town ever made about her. It outlived every kinder thing anyone in that town ever said afterward. She was 21 years old on the morning this story begins. 21, and taller than the doorframe of the boarding house where she rented a room, built for someone else's shoulders. She turned sideways to pass through it. Every morning, 4 years running. And every single time it still landed like an insult nobody had ever bothered to take back. Snow was coming, she could smell it before she saw it. That flat metal smell that rides in ahead of the real cold. The old trappers called it iron breath. October in the Larkspur territory did not ask permission before it turned into November. It simply arrived. Sudden, rude. The way most things arrived in Bryda's experience. She dressed in the gray half-light of her room, because there was no fire up there worth waiting on. Wool stockings first. Then the brown wool dress she'd let out at the shoulders 3 times and taken in at the waist twice, because a body like hers did not come in any pattern a catalog ever sold. Then the shawl. Her own hands had made that shawl. Every knot of it out of scraps too small for anybody else's use. Big scraps for a big woman. That was about the only mercy the world had ever seen fit to extend her. The leftover kind. She caught her reflection once in the sliver of mirror nailed crooked to the wall. Nothing monstrous in that face. Wide jaw. Steady eyes. Ordinary, really. Whatever the children on Kettle Street liked to whisper when they thought she couldn't hear them. It was only the rest of her the town had never gotten used to. 2 heads of height over any man in the room. Hands that could span a hay bale, end to end. Shoulders that ducked through doors built for people half her size, 21 years old. And not one soul in Ashford Creek knew it was her birthday. Not one. She had stopped expecting them to know, years back. She had not quite stopped noticing that they didn't. She had come to Ashford Creek 4 years ago, riding in the back of a freight wagon with everything she owned rolled into a bedroll built for someone half her size. Before that, there had been other towns, other rooms rented by the week, a farm outside Millbrook where they'd needed her back and not much else about her, a boarding house in Concordia where the landlady had taken one look at her in the doorway and said, "Plain as you please. I don't know that you'll fit anywhere in this house, dear," and had meant it unkindly, and that had somehow made it worse. She did not think about those years often. There was no profit in it. A woman could spend her whole life totaling up every door that hadn't fit her, every chair that had creaked a warning under her when she sat, every mother who had pulled her child a half step closer on the sidewalk without ever once looking Bryda in the eye while she did it. She could spend her whole life on that arithmetic, and it would never once add up to anything but grief. So she had stopped doing the sums, mostly. What she had learned instead, in all those towns before this one, was the shape of the bargain the world was willing to offer a woman like her. You work. We tolerate. Neither side speaks of love. It was not a bargain she had chosen. It was simply the only one on the table, in every town she had ever walked into. And by the time she reached Ashford Creek, she had stopped expecting the terms to change. Ashford Creek, to its credit, had at least been honest about it. Nobody here pretended she was anything other than useful. That honesty, strange as it sounded even inside her own head, was worth something. She would rather be plainly used than falsely loved. She had told herself that so many times over the years that she had very nearly stopped noticing it was a thing a person had to tell herself at all, rather than a thing that was simply true. There had been one exception, just the one. She did not let herself think of it often, because thinking of it cost more than it gave back, but it came to her sometimes anyway, uninvited, the way certain memories do. A barn dance back in her second year in Ashford Creek. She had not wanted to go. Widow Colworth had talked her into it. Some notion about a young woman needing to be seen by more than the inside of a mending basket, and Bryda had gone mostly to quiet the talking. A man named Silas Reeve had asked her to dance. He was not a small man himself, taller than most, broad through the shoulder, and for one entire song, one whole 3 minutes of fiddle music in a barn strung with lantern light, Bryda Calder had danced with a man who did not have to bend his neck back to look her in the eye. She remembered that detail more than any other, the plain, ordinary miracle of a face level with her own. He had asked to walk her home after. She remembered that too. And she remembered with a clarity that had never once dulled, no matter how many years she stacked on top of it. The 3 friends of his who had caught him at the barn door. The laughing. Not cruel laughing. Not exactly just the kind of laughing men do among themselves, careless, thoughtless. The kind that never once considers who might be standing close enough to hear it. Reeves' own face going red. His own laugh, joining theirs a half-second too late, a half-second too loud. The way a man laughs when he is deciding, right there in front of you, which version of himself he means to be. He had not walked her home. He had found some excuse, mumbled and unconvincing, and Bryda had walked the mile back to the boarding house alone, in the dark, at her own long stride, and had told herself the whole way that it did not matter, that she had not wanted his company particularly anyhow, that a woman who needed no one could never be let down by anyone. She had believed that mostly, by the time she reached her own crooked doorframe. Mostly. She did not go to any more barn dances after that. It was not, she told herself, a rule she had made on purpose. It was only that she had never again found herself particularly in the mood for fiddle music. Downstairs, Widow Colworth set a bowl of cornmeal mush in front of her without a word. Same as any other morning. Bryda ate it standing near the stove, because standing near the stove was the only warmth the arrangement allowed her. She did not say what day it was. There was no one in that kitchen who'd have thought the news worth the breath. You learn that if you're built the way Bryda was built. You learn to move quiet through a room. Not because quiet comes natural to her, it didn't. Not underneath, but because a woman shaped like a barn door draws enough eyes on her own. Adding noise to size only doubled the staring. She had 3 mended shirts and a torn quilt to deliver to the mercantile that morning. She wrapped the bundle in brown paper, hands too large for the work, and somehow, the way her hands always somehow managed it, the corners came out crisp anyway. Needle and thread. The one gift the years had pressed into her. The patient joining of things that had come apart. It kept a roof over her head in this town, if not much else. On her way down Kettle Street, old Garrett Poole flagged her down from the yard behind his smithy, waving both arms like a man drowning on dry land. Miss Calder. Miss Calder, hold up now. She stopped. She always stopped. That was the arrangement, too. The one nobody ever wrote down, but everybody in town understood plain enough. Garrett needed something moved. Something too heavy for 2 ordinary men and not worth the coin to hire 4. The anvil, he said, out of breath just from the walking. Shifted in the flood last spring. Sits crooked as sin. I've had Devlin and his boy try it twice, and both times they like to put their backs out for nothing. Where do you want it? 2 foot left, maybe 3. She crossed the yard, set her hands to the iron, and did not bother rolling up her sleeves first, because there wasn't any use pretending this was going to take effort. It didn't. She lifted the anvil the way another woman might lift a basket of wash, walked it 2 feet, set it down, and stepped back before Garrett could finish, thanking her for something that had cost her nothing at all. Obliged, he said. And then, because men like Garrett Poole could never quite let a kindness sit without souring it. A little at the edges, he added. Lord, but you'd make some man a fine plow horse. She had heard worse. She had heard that exact line, or near enough to it, from 3 other men in this town alone. I charge for plowing, she said. Same as mending. Garrett laughed too loud, the way people laughed when they weren't sure if they'd been insulted back or not, and Bryda walked on before he could decide. The mercantile smelled the way it always smelled. Coal oil. Dry goods. Pickle brine working itself sour in the barrel by the stove. Emmett Dre counted her coins onto the counter careful and slow, the way a man counts, who tried once foolishly to shortchange her and never once tried it again. Widow Colworth's quilt, Bryda said, setting the bundle down. And Poole's shirts. He'll want them by Thursday. He's got a wedding to stand up for. Whose wedding? Didn't ask. Man doesn't tell me his business. I don't go digging for it. That's a rare policy in this town. That's why I'm the only one keeping it. Emmett almost smiled at that. Almost. He was counting out her coin when the bell over the door rang, and two men came in stamping snow off their boots, and Emmett's whole face changed the way a man's face changes when he recognizes money walking toward him. She knew the lean one from 3 days back. Town coat, town boots, the kind of clothes that had never once been asked to do a lick of real work. Corwin Vale had a way of leaning against a counter that suggested rooms generally rearranged themselves to suit him, and he did it now, easy as breathing, while the younger man beside him, same sharp features, 10 years less wear on them, hung back near the stove with his hands in his pockets, looking bored the way young men look bored right up until the moment they don't. Mr. Vale, Emmett said, in the voice he kept polished for anybody who looked like they might spend freely, back again. Never left. Mr. Dre, this territory's grown on me. Vale's eyes slid sideways, found Bryda, and did the thing most strangers' eyes did, widened, just slightly, then caught themselves and smoothed back out, too late to hide that they'd widened at all. That's not a sight you get in the city? No, Bryda said. I don't imagine it is. No offense meant. None taken. Not yet. The younger man near the stove laughed once, short and surprised, like the sound had gotten out before he'd decided whether to let it. Dallin, Vale said without turning around, in the tone of a man correcting a dog that had barked out of turn. Just saying she gave it back quick. She did. Most don't. Most, Bryda said, haven't had 4 years of practice. That got a longer look out of the younger one, Dallin. Apparently, though he hadn't offered the name himself. Hadn't offered her anything at all except that one bored laugh, and for a second she thought he might say something else. He didn't. He went back to leaning on the stove, and Bryda told herself she didn't care one way or the other what a stranger's younger brother thought of her, and mostly believed it. Vale's mouth twitched. Whether it was annoyance or amusement, Bryda couldn't tell and didn't much care to find out. He turned back to Emmett and picked up wherever he'd left off 3 days ago, the same easy patter about parcels and back taxes and ground the government had no particular love for. There's a great deal of ground up in that range. Nobody's touched in 40 years, Vale was saying. Claims filed before the war, half of them, holders long dead or drifted off, and the paper just sitting in some county book, gathering dust nobody's bothered to blow off. A man could acquire the lot of it for the taxes owed, if he knew which parcels, and moved quick enough that nobody else thought to. Sounds like a great deal of work for empty ground, Emmett said. It's only empty till the railroad men decide it isn't, Vale said, and smiled that smile again, the one that never once climbed as high as his eyes. Then it's the only ground anybody wants. Survey crews already through the southern pass, Dallin put in from his spot by the stove, sounding for the first time like a man contributing something rather than merely killing time. Word is they favor the iron vein grade over the pass at Coleridge. Cheaper to lay track through. My brother has a gift for arriving ahead of good news, Vale said, and there was something in the way he said, brother, that made Bryda glance up, briefly, from her coins. Not warmth exactly. More the pride a man takes in a tool that has never once failed to do what it was built for. Ahead of it, Emmett repeated, turning the phrase over like he wasn't sure he cared for the taste of it. That's one way to put buying up dead men's land, before the families had time to grieve them proper. Nobody's grieving, Mr. Dre. That's rather the point. 40 years and not one soul's come forward to work those claims, pay those taxes, or so much as walk the boundary line. The law doesn't ask a man to wait forever on a ghost that never shows itself. Vale straightened his coat, unhurried, a man who considered the conversation settled whether or not anybody else in the room agreed with him. I find it's usually kinder in the end to let dead ground go to somebody willing to make use of it. Kinder to who, Bryda said. It came out before she'd quite decided to say it, and for a second the room held still around the question. Vale turned his head toward her, slow, and that smile widened by exactly the amount that told her he did not consider it a real question, only a piece of noise he was choosing, generously, to acknowledge to the territory, Miss, I didn't catch it, I didn't offer it. No, he agreed. Easy as anything. I suppose you didn't. Bryda gathered her coins into the twist of paper Emmett handed her, and turned to go. She thought no more of Vale than she'd have thought of any drummer passing through with a case of patent tonic to sell. Except the way he'd said empty ground snagged on her, the way a burr snags wool, and she was 3 steps toward the door before Emmett Dre leaned across his own counter and dropped his voice down low, the way a man does when he believes gossip is worth more for the whispering of it. Iron vein, he said. That's the range he's sniffing around. Words come down, there's ore up in those folds. Iron, maybe silver under it. And Vale's been 3 months buying up abandoned claims before the railroad survey comes through. And the price of that whole mountain jumps from nothing to everything a man's got. Nothing to do with me, Bryda said. No, Emmett agreed, and looked for one uncomfortable second like a man wanting to say something kinder than he had the words for. No, I don't suppose it is. On her way out the door, she nearly collided with Mrs. Aldous Fenwick, who ran the boarding house 2 doors down from Widow Colworth's, and had never once, in 4 years, managed to say Bryda's name without a small pause in front of it, as though she were deciding all over again whether the woman in front of her had earned the courtesy. Miss Calder, there it was. The pause. I wonder if I might trouble you. Depends on the trouble. My porch step. It's come loose of its post, and Mr. Fenwick's back won't allow him to see to it, and I did think, given your she paused again, her eyes making the brief journey up and back down that most people's eyes made, cataloging height, shoulders, hands, before landing back on Bryda's face as though remembering, a beat too late, that a face was where a conversation was supposed to happen given your particular strength. You might set it right for a small fee. I could. This afternoon, perhaps. I've a delivery out past the creek first. I could come by after if the weather holds. Mrs. Fenwick's gaze went to the window, to the sky, pressing down gray and low over the rooftops, and something crossed her face that might have been concern for Bryda, and might, just as easily, have been irritation that her porch step would have to wait on somebody else's schedule. Well, she said, see that you do come whenever you manage it. I don't like to ask twice. You've never had to. No. Mrs. Fenwick loud and of a woman conceding a point she hadn't meant to concede. No, I suppose I haven't. She swept out without another word, the bell over the door jangling behind her, and Emmett Dray, from behind his counter, caught Bryda's eye and did not quite smile, but came close enough to it that Bryda felt the corner of her own mouth tug back in answer. She means well, Emmett offered. She means her porch step fixed. Whether she means well besides that, I couldn't say, and it isn't really my business to wonder. You're kinder to this town than it deserves, Miss Calder. I'm not being kind, I'm being paid. She hefted her satchel higher on her shoulder. There's a difference, even if nobody in this town ever bothers to notice it. She left with her coins and her paper twist, and the itch of Vale's voice caught somewhere under her ribs where it had no business lodging. Empty ground. As if a mountain that had swallowed whole families in its time, and mountains up here did that. Everybody knew it. Everybody had a story about somebody's cousin who went up and didn't come down, could ever rightly be called empty by anyone, on who'd bothered to look at it properly. She passed the church on her way back up Kettle Street, and Reverend Pruett was out front sweeping the step, and he lifted a hand to her the way he always did. Reverend Pruett was one of the few in Ashford Creek who never once looked up at her the way most men looked up at her, chin tilted, eyes measuring. He just looked at her the way he looked at anybody. She had never decided whether that made him kinder than the rest of the town or simply less observant. Miss Calder, you've a look about you this morning. What sort of look? The sort that generally precedes trouble. He set the broom against the door frame. You're not thinking of walking out to Hobbs's place, are you? Not with that sky. Man needs his coat before the cold shuts him in. Man's survived 40 winters without your coat arriving exactly on schedule. Then one more delivery won't kill him either way. Pruett studied her a moment, patient, unhurried, the way he studied anybody, like a man reading a verse he already half knew the ending to. It's your birthday, he said. Not a question. She went very still. I keep the parish register, he said gently, as though that explained something, and maybe it did. Baptisms and the like. I noticed the date some years back and never said anything, because you never once gave me the sense you wanted it said. I didn't. No, I thought not. He picked the broom back up. Happy birthday, Bryda Calder. For whatever that's worth to you today. Not much, she said, and was surprised, hearing it out loud, at how much it cost her to say. But I thank you for it anyway. She walked on before he could see whatever her face was doing, and did not look back, and told herself the wind was the reason her eyes were stinging, the same wind that hadn't even properly started yet. She spent the rest of the morning at the small jobs that filled her days, and all the while the sky kept lowering itself. Closer, meaner. Clouds sliding down off the peaks like something spilled and left to run its own course. By noon the wind had teeth in it. She stood in the doorway of Widow Colworth's washroom. The laundry the boarding house ran below its rented rooms. The one doorway in the whole building tall enough that she didn't have to stoop, which was, in its own small and accidental way, the closest thing to a compliment that building had ever paid her, and felt the old pull toward the high country sharpen into something close to hunger. There was a reason, or she told herself there was one. Ezekiel Hobbs, who trapped along the foot of the range, had left word 2 weeks back that he'd pay for a set of heavy gloves and a lined coat, mended proper, before the deep cold shut him in for the season. His cabin sat right at the foothills, a fair walk past the creek. She could carry the work up, collect her coin, be back well before dark, if she stepped lively about it. That was the reason she gave Widow Colworth. "You'll be a fool about the weather," the widow said, without looking up from her own mending, which was as close as the widow ever came to affection. "I generally am," Bryda said, and meant it as a joke, and heard, underneath it, that it wasn't only that. She laced her boots tight, packed the mended coat into a satchel built oversized to fit her own oversized shoulder, alongside a heel of bread and a tin flask of coffee already going lukewarm. And she knew, even while she told herself otherwise, that Hobbs's coin was the smallest part of why she was walking out that door. The larger part of it was this. On the one day of the year that was supposed to belong to her, she wanted to be somewhere the emptiness was honest. The mountains never once pretended to want her. There was a kind of relief in that, after a life spent among people who pretended plenty. She set out along the creek road, with the wind pushing hard at her back. Like it, too, wanted her gone from town faster than her own 2 legs could manage. The creek road ran wide and easy at first, hugging the water where it caught what little light the sky was still willing to spare. Cottonwoods stood bare along the bank, black, limned against the gray, and somewhere off to her left a hawk was fighting the wind for altitude and mostly losing, tumbling sideways in a gust, before catching itself and trying again. She watched it a while as she walked. Stubborn thing. She admired that in a creature, stubbornness, having relied on a fair amount of it herself over the years. The land here still remembered it had been gold and green not 3 months back. Now it was only stubble and frost, the whole valley gone the color of a coin worn thin from handling, and past it, closer with every mile she put behind her. The Iron Vein Range climbed up out of the foothills like something that had always meant to be there and had simply been waiting, patient as rock, for the rest of the country to catch up to it. For the first hour, the walk was only bracing. Cold, clean in her lungs. Dead grass hissing flat all around her, the way a held breath finally lets go. She covered ground fast, the one unarguable gift of a body her size. The stride that ate distance other people had to earn a mile at a time, and by the time Hobbs's cabin came into view, low and dark against the foothills, the first fat flakes had begun to spin down out of a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise. The cabin was shuttered, cold. A note tacked to the door in a crabbed, hurried hand. "Gone up to check my lines, back by nightfall." Bryda stood there with the mended coat in her hands, and the sensible thing to do, she knew it, the way she knew her own name, was to leave the work on the step and turn straight back for town. She did not do the sensible thing. She could never afterward fully explain why. Maybe it was the birthday. Maybe it was the wanting of 1 hour that felt entirely her own. Maybe it was only that the trail past Hobbs's cabin climbed up into a stand of pine she'd looked at from a safe, respectful distance for 4 straight years, and never once entered. And today, with nobody waiting on her, and nothing much left to lose, the wanting to see past that tree line had grown bigger than her good sense. She left the coat wrapped against the wet, tucked under the eave where the snow couldn't reach, and she climbed. The snow was falling in earnest by the time she gained the pines, not the pretty drifting flakes of open ground anymore. A thickening curtain, the kind that hushes the whole world at once, swallowing sound and distance together in the same white breath. She'd meant to go only a little way, far enough to stand under the great trunks and look back down at the valley she'd never once seen from above. But the valley was already gone, wiped out behind her by the white, and when she turned to find the trail she'd come up by, the forest had done exactly what forests do in a storm. It had rearranged itself, every gap between the trees suddenly identical, every fallen log wearing the same soft blanket, the same false invitation to rest a moment, just a moment, right here. She was not frightened, not yet. She told herself she was not frightened, which was, of course, the first sign that she was. Downhill. She only had to go downhill. Downhill would bring her to the creek, and the creek would bring her home. Simple enough. Except the ground did not slope the way she remembered it sloping, and she walked what she was dead, certain was down and found. Somehow, that she was climbing. She corrected. And the correction led her into a narrow ravine that pinched shut against a wall of rock she had never once laid eyes on in her life. Because that was the trouble with a mountain in a storm. It didn't care how big you were. It didn't care that you could lift an anvil with one hand and pass through some doors bent nearly double just to fit. Up here, size bought her nothing. Up here she was exactly as lost as anybody else, who'd ever wandered too far past a tree line chasing 1 hour that felt like her own. The wind found a new pitch. Driven, sideways now, carrying ice like grit flung from a blacksmith's wheel. The little daylight the storm allowed thinned toward the gray of late afternoon, hours too soon, and Bryfa stopped in the lee of a boulder and made herself be still, because panic was the thing that killed people up here. She'd heard it 100 times from the old teamsters who wintered in Ashford Creek, heard it enough that the words had worn a groove clean through her. It was never the cold alone that took a person. It was the fear that set them running in circles until the cold finally caught up and finished what the fear had started. So she stood, breathing slow, brushing snow off her lashes, telling herself the way you'd talk down a spooked horse. Think, just think. She had her satchel, her flask, the heel of bread, a small clasp knife, and folded into a scrap of oilcloth, flint and steel, carried out of the same old habit, because a person who could make fire could survive a great many things a person who couldn't, wouldn't. What she did not have was any notion which way lay the world of the living. She chose the direction that felt most like descent and pushed on, because standing still while the light failed was its own slow way of dying, and the forest closed in tighter around her, and it was strange it would be strange to think about later. Once this night was well and truly over how the loneliness she'd carried around for 21 years rose up now, right in the middle of real danger, and felt almost like company. Cold. Familiar. The way an old ache is familiar. All her life she'd told herself that needing no one was its own kind of strength, that a woman who leaned on nobody could never be let down by anybody. Now, with the snow filling her tracks behind her as fast as she made them, she understood the small lie folded up inside that belief. Because if she went down out here, no search party was coming. Nobody would stand at a window back in town, watching the road for her shape to come up over the ridge. The widow might wonder, in a day or two, why the girl hadn't come back for her things, and then she'd rent the attic room to somebody whose shoulders fit the doorway. And that would be that. That would be the whole of the Mark Bryta Calder left on this earth, an unpaid week of board. A carpetbag of oversized mending nobody else in town could wear. The thought did not make her weep. It made her walk faster. Except faster wasn't a direction. That was the part her legs kept forgetting, and her mind kept having to remind them of. Faster was just faster, straight into whatever waited, and she had no earthly idea what was waiting. She could hear her own breath now, ragged, too loud in her own ears, and she thought absurdly of Garrett Poole's anvil. How easy that had been. How her hands had known exactly what to do with 200 pounds of dead iron and had no idea at all what to do with a mountain that refused to hold still. Big as a barn door, she thought. Useful as one too, apparently, because barn doors don't know which way is home either. She almost laughed. The sound that came out instead was not a laugh. Stop it, she told herself. Stop that right now. You are going to walk, and you are going to keep walking. And you are not going to spend what's left of the feeling sorry for yourself in a snowstorm, because self-pity has never once kept a body warm, and it is not going to start tonight. The ground betrayed her twice more before the light finally failed entirely. The first time, a hidden shelf of rock, iced over and invisible beneath a soft new blanket of snow, took her feet clean out from under her, and she went down hard on one hip, the satchel skidding away into a drift, and lay there for one long, ringing second listening to her own heartbeat, and wondering, with the strange calm that comes right before real panic, whether this was simply how it happened, whether a person just went down, one ordinary misstep at a time, until the mountain had collected enough of them to bother finishing the job. She got up, because that was the only answer worth having, and she gave it to herself the way she'd give an order to somebody else, flat and final, and not open for discussion. She dug the satchel out of the drift with hands that had stopped feeling much of anything below the wrist, and she kept on. The second time was worse. The ground simply stopped, without warning, without so much as a change in the sound of her own boots to tell her it was coming, and she felt the world tip sideways and knew, in the half-second before her body caught up with the knowledge, that she was going over the lip of some gully she hadn't seen, and wouldn't have seen even with a clear sky over her head. Her hand found a root, frozen solid, thick as her own wrist, and it held because her grip held, because whatever else the years had taken from her, they had never once taken her strength, and for the first time all day, being built the way she was built, felt less like a burden and more like the only thing standing between her and a fall she would not have walked away from. She hauled herself back onto level ground, breathing hard, snow packed into the collar of her dress, and sat a moment in the howling dark with her back against a tree trunk, letting her heart slow. Big as a barn door, she thought again, and this time there was no bitterness in it at all. Just plain fact. A barn door, at least, could hold a beam that would have snapped a smaller woman's grip in half. She got up a third time. She did not fall again. Until the wind found a new voice altogether, a low, mournful drone through the high branches, the kind of sound that seemed almost to shape itself into words if a person listened wrong on purpose. Bryda kept her eyes down on the ground in front of her boots and her mind on the next step, and the one after that, and she had very nearly stopped believing this mountain intended to offer her anything at all, but more mountain, except she glanced left, through a gap in the driving snow, and saw a shape that stopped her cold. It stood among the pines at the edge of a small clearing, half buried, its lines softened by decades of weather and moss, so that for one full heartbeat she took it for a boulder or the trunk of some fallen giant of a tree gone strange in the stormlight. But boulders don't have corners. Trees don't stand square. The shape had edges. Corners the storm couldn't entirely blur, the deliberate, patient geometry that only a human hand ever makes. And as she pushed toward it through the drifts, her heart slammed hard against her ribs. Not from the cold anymore. From something that felt absurdly, out here at the far end of everything, almost like hope. It was a cabin. Or it had been born as something else, and become a cabin over long years of use and stubborn repair. As she drew close, she saw it plain in the failing light. The sloped roof heavy under its own weight of snow. Low walls of squared timber gone silver gray. And beneath the years of patching and shelter, the unmistakable shape of a wagon at the very heart of it. An old freighter's wagon, the kind that had crossed the plains a full generation before it ever born. Its box grown into a dwelling, lean-tos and additions stacked on, until the original bones of the thing were nearly swallowed whole. Somebody had driven that wagon up into this hollow when the country was younger than she was. Somebody had stopped here, and out of nothing but the wreck of a wagon in their own two hands, had made a home. The wonder of it drove the fear back for one long moment. Who builds so far from every road? So deep in a fold of this range that 4 years of living in its shadow had never once shown her this place existed? The wind answered with a fresh gust that drove ice straight into her cheek, and Bryda put the questions away. Because questions were for the living, and she meant to keep on being that. She waded to the door through drifts that reached past her knee, which, for most people, would have meant drifts past the waist, but her stride carried her through where a smaller woman would have had to swim it. It was a stout door, plank and iron, set into a frame the years hadn't yet pulled crooked. Snow had banked hard against the sill, packed and frozen solid. She set her shoulder to it. Most doors in Bryda's life had been built by people who never once imagined a shoulder like hers pressing against them. This one gave the way old wood gives to a strength it was never built to resist. One long, groaning shudder, ice cracking loose from the hinges in a shower of white. And then the door swung inward on darkness, on the held breath of a place that had not been opened in a very long time. She stepped inside, pulled the door shut behind her, and all at once the storm went distant. The wind still spoke, but it spoke through walls now, muffled down to a rumor. The snow that had been a stinging assault a moment before was only a soft, patient ticking against the shutters. Bryda stood dripping in the sudden hush, eyes straining against the near dark, heart still going hard in her chest. It was cold inside, but it was the still cold of shut-up air, not the killing cold of open wind. And after the mountain, that difference felt for one unguarded second, like a mercy she hadn't earned. Slowly, as her eyes adjusted, the room gave itself up to her. small, orderly. And the order was the first thing that told her this had been no rough shelter thrown together by some passing trapper waiting out a storm. Every foot of that space had been used with a care that spoke of people who meant to stay, people who'd lived with scarcity long enough to know exactly what waste cost them. A narrow bench ran along one wall, its top worn smooth by years of sitting. Shelves climbed the timbers, holding onto the ghosts of a household, a few tin plates, a cracked crock, a coil of rope gone stiff with age, a table folded flat against the wall on iron hinges, so the floor could be cleared when it was needed for other work. Pegs for coats, a bunk built into the far end, rope webbing sagging but sound, and at the center of it all squat, black, patient as a held-in breath, a cast-iron stove. On one of the pegs by the door hung a coat old, moth-worked at the shoulders, the wool gone thin as paper poor in places. But Brida's eye went to it and stayed there because she knew, the way anyone who has spent a lifetime altering other people's clothing knows, exactly what she was looking at. That coat had not been cut for an ordinary man. The sleeves ran a full hand's length past where a sleeve ought to end. The shoulders were built wide enough that two of Emmett Dre could have stood inside it together and had room left to spare. She stood looking at it a moment too long, water dripping off her own shawl onto the swept floor, and told herself it was nothing. Big men existed. Big coats got made for them, now and again, same as anybody. She told herself that. She did not entirely believe it. She crossed to the bunk built into the far end of the room and, on some impulse she didn't examine too closely, lay her own forearm along its length. It ran a full towards her past where her elbow met the wood. She straightened up quickly, as though she'd been caught at something. The shelves told the same quiet story, once she started looking for it. A wash basin set higher on its bracket than any wash basin she'd ever used in Ashford Creek, comfortable to a woman who did not have to stoop to reach it. A row of pegs by the door, spaced wider than pegs were generally spaced, as if to hang coats built with room enough in the shoulder, that they wouldn't crowd each other. None of it shouted. All of it, taken together, said the same single word, over and over, in every plank and peg and shelf height in the room. Someone. Someone had lived here who needed the world built a size larger than the world usually bothered to build it. She noticed before anything else the height of the doorway she'd just come through. Full height. Not stoop, not ducked, not 1 inch shaved off for anybody's comfort, but her own. She stood a full moment, just inside it, the way you feel the strangeness of a shoe that, finally, after years, fits. She'd think about that later, too. For now, she crossed to the stove the way a drowning swimmer crosses to a spar. Knelt, which for her was not so much kneeling as folding, the way a barn door folds on a hinge, and laid her bare, aching hand flat against the iron. Cold. Of course it was cold, but it was whole. The firebox door opened at her touch without complaint, and inside, incredibly, she found the makings already laid. Kindling. Split spruce arranged by some hand long since stilled, waiting. That gave her pause. A stove left ready to light was a stove somebody had expected to come back to. She filed the strangeness away and didn't let herself dwell on it, because her fingers had gone past aching into a numbness that frightened her worse than the storm had, and warmth was the only thought her whole body would allow her to hold on to. She had her flint, her steel, her scrap of oilcloth for tinder. She set to the work her hands knew even when her mind was fogged with cold, and it was as she bent close to the firebox, coaxing the first frail spark into something that might survive its own birth, that she saw the writing, carved into the timber wall, just above the stove, low down, exactly where a person, kneeling to tend a fire, would be certain to see it. Not plain letters, cut deep, by someone, with no particular hurry, someone who understood that words gouged into wood outlast the hand that gouges them. Keep the low draft open in a storm, it read, or she'll smoke and choke you. Below that, same patient hand, dry spruce, catches quickest, cottonwood not at all. And below that, lower still, nearly at the floor, if the smoke backs down, the east pipe wants clearing. Do it before you sleep. She sat back on her heels and stared at those carved words while the wind moaned on beyond the walls. There was nothing sentimental in them. They were instructions, nothing more. The practical bequest of one person to whatever stranger came after. And yet something in them reached across the cold dark and touched her nearer than any kindness she'd been shown in years. Whoever had cut these letters had known that someday somebody might stumble in here half frozen and frightened, might kneel right where she was kneeling with numb fingers and a failing heart, and had wanted across all the years, standing between then and now, to help that stranger live. It was a thought so unlike anything her own life had ever taught her to expect that she had to blink hard against a stinging in her eyes, which she chose firmly to blame on the cold. She did what the wall told her, found the low draft, worked it open, and saw that yes, she'd very nearly closed it in her haste. Fed the first catching flame with dry spruce and not the pale cottonwood stacked to one side. And when the smoke rose, it didn't linger and choke her. It climbed clean into the pipe and away the fire took. It took the way a living thing takes hold of its one chance to live small and blue at first, then yellow, then leaping, its light swelling to fill the little room, throwing the shelves and the bench and the folded table into flickering relief. Bryda held her hand so close to the furniture box. The skin burned and tingled as feeling came back into it, and she let out a breath that was half a laugh, the strange, broken kind. That's what relief sounds like, coming out of somebody who isn't used to it. The warmth spread slow, then all at once, into the iron, into the air, into the very timbers until the cabin seemed almost to wake up around her, to remember what it was built for. She peeled her sodden shawl off and hung it on a peg, as though she had a right to, as though she were a guest here, and not a trespasser, and she sank down onto the worn bench. She noted with a small, grim humor, built wide enough that she didn't have to perch sideways on it the way she perched on every chair back in Ashford Creek, and let the heat begin its slow, patient work on her. Outside, the storm went on with its long complaint against the mountain. Inside, for the first time on the day she turned 21, Bryda Calder was warm, safe, and not quite so alone as she'd been that morning. The people who'd built this place were long gone. She could feel their absence like a shape pressed into the very air. But she could feel their presence too in the worn bench, the careful shelves, the words cut into the wall to save a stranger's life. And the two feelings together made something in her chest she had no name for. A sorrow and a comfort, braided so tight she couldn't have pulled the two of them apart if she'd tried. She got up once, stiff already, and crossed to the door to listen. The wind hadn't slackened. If anything, it had found a second wind of its own, howling now with the fury storms tended to save for full dark. And she knew, the way she knew most practical things, that walking back out into that would be a different kind of foolishness than the kind that had gotten her lost in the first place. There would be no finding the creek tonight, no finding anything at all, except maybe the bottom of a ravine she wouldn't climb back out of. She would stay. There was no shame in the decision, whatever Widow Colworth might say about it later, and no other decision worth making besides. She fed the fire again, banked it careful the way the wall had taught her, and told herself she would sleep an hour no more, enough to steady herself before first light. She did not in the end sleep even that much. She might have slept then, worn out, the way she was, except the mountain wasn't finished with her, and neither, as it turned out, was the cabin. She shifted her weight along the bench to bring her back closer to the stove, and her hip pressed against something in the seat that gave, just slightly, with a sound different from the rest of the wood. A hollow knock, where solid should have been. She went still, shifted again deliberately, this time, and heard it a second time. That same hollow note of empty space hiding behind a panel that was never meant to look like anything but a panel. Her heart, which had only just begun to slow, picked up all over again. She knelt, ran her two large fingers along the underside of the bench, careful, patient, the same patience she gave a hem that refused to lie flat. And there, where the firelight barely reached, her fingertips found what her eyes had missed entirely. A seam too straight to be an accident of the wood, and set into it, a small iron pole, worn smooth as though many hands, over many years, had reached for exactly this same spot. She hooked two fingers through it. She hesitated. One long heartbeat. The kind a person takes standing at the edge of something she already suspects will not let her go back to being who she was 5 minutes before. Then she pulled. A shallow slid free from beneath the bench with a whisper of wood. On wood, dust rising gold and slow through the firelight. And inside, a bundle, wrapped in a square of cloth, once perhaps blue, now the no color of things kept too long in the dark. Bound with twine gone brittle, and near black with age. It had been placed there with care. That much was plain before she'd even touched it, wrapped and tied and set down into the dark by someone who wanted it kept, someone who had chosen this hidden drawer over any open shelf, someone who had trusted the future, whoever the future turned out to be, to bring the right hands to it, in the right hour. Bryda lifted it out. It was light, far lighter than her mind, in one foolish, unguarded instant, had already leapt to expect. And when her fingers pressed the cloth, she felt beneath it not metal, but the soft, yielding thickness of paper. Many sheets, folded and folded again. She carried the bundle to the bench nearest the stove and sat with it in her lap, and for a long moment she only looked at it. This small, mute parcel that had waited in the dark of a forgotten cabin through more winters than she herself had been alive to count. The twine crumbled almost at her touch. The cloth fell open. And inside, just as her fingers had already promised her, were letters. Dozens of them folded in the old way, sealed once and long since opened. The paper gone the color of weak tea at the edges. The ink faded in places to a ghost of itself, and in others still dark and sure and steady. There was no treasure here in the way that stranger back at the mercantile veil with his gloved finger tapping the counter would have understood treasure. No gold, no bond, no deed. There were only words. Somebody's words, set down by lamplight in this very room, saved against the ruined time by hands that had loved something enough to want it to outlast them. She should have felt disappointed. Some small, hard-taught part of her had leapt, in that first instant of the sliding drawer, toward a wild and childish hope of riches, the kind of hope a hard life teaches a person to be ashamed of, even as it rises anyway, uninvited. But looking down at the letters in the firelight, Bryda felt no disappointment at all. She felt instead something closer to being addressed, as though a light had been left burning in a window a very long way off, and she, wandering half frozen out of a storm that should have killed her, had at last seen it, and come to it, and found that it had been lit, somehow, for someone exactly like her. She lifted the topmost letter with a care that surprised her, holding it close to the stove where the light was best, and unfolded it along creases worn so old they had nearly worn all the way through. The hand was plain and strong. A working hand, unschooled, but sure the writing of someone who did not put pen to paper often, but wrote when it mattered enough to be worth the effort. She had to lean close and turn the page toward the firelight to optomatic faded lines. December the 4th, it began. The snow came early this year, and hard. The roof held through the night, thank God, though Nettie lay awake till dawn certain the wind would tear it off over our heads. It did not. It never has. A man builds a thing well the first time, so he need not build it twice, my father used to say. And I have tried to be that kind of man out here, where there is no one to build it for us but ourselves. Bryda read it twice. The plainness of it, the ordinary domestic worry of a roof holding through a storm, reached into her with a strange, sudden force. She could almost see them, this Nettie, lying awake, afraid of the wind. This man answering his own fear with the memory of his father's counsel. They had sat in this exact room. They had listened to a storm not so different from the one now hammering against the shutters over her own head, and they had been afraid, and they had held on anyway. She unfolded the next letter, and the one after that, and the entries were none of them grand. Firewood laid by, and firewood running low. A crop taken in that autumn that would carry them through. A spring that ran sweet and cold from the rock behind the cabin, and never once froze solid, no matter how deep the cold went, so that they had named it, and blessed it, and built the whole shape of their lives around it. There were no adventures in those pages. There was only living the daily, fierce, persistent work of staying alive, and keeping the people you loved alive alongside you. And somehow that moved her more than any tale of daring ever could have, because it was true. Because it was the exact thing she herself had done every single day of her life, without once believing it counted for anything at all. One name began to surface as she read, threaded through the entries like a bright cord pulled taut. A son. Rowan. The name meant nothing to her yet. It was only a word on old paper. She read past it the first time without her pulse so much as changing pace. Rowan took a fever at the spring, and Nettie near, went out of her mind. One letter said, "But he is stubborn as his mother, and worse as his father, and he is up and about again inside the week, eating twice what he ought, and complaining he is still hungry. A boy who ate twice what he ought. A boy stubborn as both his parents put together." It was, Bryda thought, exactly the kind of thing any family anywhere might write down about any son. Nothing in it to catch on. Nothing in it to hold her attention past the turning of the page. She read 3 more in that same easy spirit. A letter about a bear that had gotten into the cache and the trouble of rebuilding it. A letter about Nettie's garden, and a frost that had come early and taken half the beans. And Ezra's opinion, offered at some length, on whose fault that was his own, mostly, for not banking the rose sooner. A letter shorter than the rest, that said only, "Good hunting this week. Meat enough to see us to spring if we are careful. And we have always been careful. It is the one thing this country teaches a man whether he wants the lesson or not. Ordinary. All of it ordinary, in the particular way that made it feel less like reading and more like sitting quietly in a corner of somebody else's kitchen, unnoticed, while real life went on happening around her. And then, 3 letters further into the bundle, in the same steady hand, one line stopped her flat. "We had trouble in town again over Rowan," it read. "Nothing I will set down here in full. It does no good to relive it twice, once in the living and once in the writing. Enough to say a boy of 9 years should not have to learn what he learned yesterday about how strangers look at a child who is not built the way they expect a child to be built. Nettie cried the whole ride home and would not let me see it, and I let her have that, because a woman is entitled to grieve private if grieving private is what gets her through the door." Brida's hand had gone still on the page. She thought of Kettle Street, of children she had never met pulling their mother's skirts a half-step wider when she passed, of the particular silence that fell over a room sometimes, just for a second, when she walked into it, not figure, exactly, not always, but a kind of recalculating, the way a person recalculates when the world in front of them doesn't match the world they'd been expecting to see. 9 years old. She tried to imagine it. A boy 9 years old, learning that lesson in the middle of a street, in front of strangers who had never once bothered to learn his name before deciding what to think of him. She had learned that same lesson herself at some age she could no longer precisely place, because it was not the kind of lesson that arrived all at once. It arrived in pieces, a look here, a comment there, a door held open a half-second too slow or a half-second too fast, both of them somehow worse than an ordinary door held at an ordinary speed. It accumulated, the way snow accumulates, quietly, one flake indistinguishable from the last, until one day a person looked up and realized she was buried under the whole weight of it, and could not entirely recall when the burying had started. "We are thinking now," the letter went on, "of whether town does this family any good at all, or whether we are only teaching our son, twice a month, that the world has already made up its mind about him before he has said a single word to prove it wrong." Brida sat with that line a long while. The fire ticked and settled. Outside, the wind had not once let up, except the next letter did catch. It caught harder still. "Rowan would not fit through the door we built him this spring," one entry read, and the hand had shifted here, a woman's hand now, smaller and looser than the man's, and I laughed till I cried, and then I cried for a different reason entirely, because he is not yet 12 years old and already he has to duck. Brida stopped breathing for a second. She read the line again, not yet 12 years old, and already he has to duck. She thought of every doorframe in Ashford Creek, every chair built for someone half her size, every child on Kettle Street whispering behind a raised hand while their mothers pretended not to notice, or worse, noticed and said nothing at all. And here in a cabin buried in a fold of the same mountain she'd gotten herself lost in not 3 hours ago, a mother had written down that exact same ordinary, unbearable fact about her own son. She turned the page too fast. Her hands were not quite steady. "Ezra says we must build him a proper door before winter." The next line read, "One that will not shame him every time he passes through it. And I told Ezra a door is only wood. And Ezra said, a door is the first thing a man learns about how the world means to treat him. And I have nothing to say back to that because he is right, and it breaks my heart that he is right." Brida set the letter down in her lap. Her big hands, for once in her life, felt too small for what they were holding, which was strange, because she had felt her hands too large for 100 small things, teacups, hymnals, the delicate stitches other women managed without half trying, and never once, not in 21 years, had she felt them too small for anything at all. She read on. She could not have stopped now if the storm itself had ordered her to. "Rowan asked me tonight why God made him this way," one letter said in the man's hand again, heavier now, slower, the ink pressed deep into the paper, as though the pen had wanted to argue with what it was writing. I did not have an answer that satisfied either of us. I told him God does not explain himself to carpenters, and carpenters build the doors anyway. He did not laugh. I do not blame him. Bryda set that page down very carefully, the way a person sets down something that has turned out to be heavier than it looked. She had asked that question too. Not out loud, not to anybody, because there had never once been anybody in her life she trusted enough to ask it of. But she had asked it in the dark plenty of times, lying under whatever roof happened to be hers that particular year, staring up at whatever ceiling happened to be over her, and never once getting an answer back that satisfied her either. God does not explain himself to carpenters. She turned the phrase over. It was, she decided, about the truest thing anybody had ever said to her, even though nobody had said it to her at all. It had been said, 40 years back, to a boy she had never met, in a cabin she'd only stumbled into because a storm had chased her half to death. And carpenters build the doors anyway. She thought of her own two hands, not built for carpentry, built instead for needle and thread, the one skill the years had pressed into her, the patient joining of things that had come apart. She had never once thought of that as a kind of building. She thought of it that way now. A torn quilt did not stay torn on her watch. A worn coat did not stay worn. She built doors too, in her own small way, out of thread instead of timber, and she had never once given herself credit for it. She read on. The next several letters carried Rowan forward the way a river carries a stone, unhurried, one season into the next. A birthday marked with a cake too small for the appetite it was meant to satisfy, and Nettie's note in the margin. He says it is enough, and I do not believe him, but I have learned not to argue with a boy who has decided to be brave about something. A winter where the boy, 12 now, 13, had hauled in more firewood alone than Ezra, and a hired man together had managed the year before, and Ezra's dry observation, we may yet come to be grateful for the very thing this country cannot forgive him for. And then, further on, in a hand that had grown surer, steadier, less like a boy's hand, and more like a young man's, Rowan pulled the Hollis wagon clean out of the wash today. Team couldn't do it. 3 men couldn't do it. He walked down, set his shoulder to the wheel, and had it up on the bank inside a minute. And old Hollis stood there afterward, not knowing whether to thank him or cross himself, and in the end did neither, just paid him and left quick, the way a man leaves a thing he does not know how to feel about. Bryda read that one twice, then a third time, because she knew that walk, the quick, uneasy leaving, the gratitude tangled up so tight with discomfort that a person couldn't manage to hand over one without the other coming along uninvited. She had been paid and left quick, out of more yards and barns than she could rightly count, and she had told herself every single time that the coin was the point of the transaction, and the leaving quick was simply how business got conducted. Reading it here, written down about somebody else in a stranger's hand, 40 years gone, it did not look like ordinary business anymore. It looked like something else, something with a name she did not entirely want to put to it yet. She read on, and the letters carried Rowan further still, into a stretch of years where the entries grew shorter, more spaced out, though the writing of them had come a thing squeezed into whatever hour was left over after a harder and harder kind of living. One line, tucked into the middle of an otherwise ordinary account of a wet spring, caught her longer than the rest. Nettie says she prays every night that somewhere in this territory there is one other soul built the way our son is built, so that he might someday know what it is not to be the only one of his kind the world has ever produced. I tell her I pray the same, though I have never once said so to Rowan himself, because a father does not like to hand his son a hope that might not be his to give. Bryda read that line 4 times. She thought of every night she herself had lain awake, in some rented room, in some town, whose name she could no longer entirely recall, wondering the exact same thing in the exact same words, though she had never once written it down for anybody to find, wondering if there was anywhere on the whole wide breadth of the earth one other person who understood exactly what it cost to walk through a world that had been measured, planned, and built without once consulting anybody her size. She had never once said the wondering out loud to a living soul, not to Widow Colworth, who would have clucked and changed the subject, not to Reverend Pruett, kind as he was, because some questions felt too raw to hand even to a kind man, not even to herself most nights, because a question asked too often in the dark starts to feel less like hope and more like a wound a person keeps picking at for no good reason. She had never gotten an answer to that wondering. Not until tonight. Not until a storm had chased her half to death and shoved her, half frozen, through a door built a full size larger than any door had ever needed to be built for her sake, except it hadn't been built for her sake at all. It had been built 40 years before she was born, for somebody else entirely, by two people who had prayed, in the dark, the exact same prayer she had prayed. The fire cracked and settled behind her. She sat very still, 21 years old, in the flickering dark of a stranger's cabin, and felt something old and guarded shift, loose inside her chest, some small locked room she had stopped visiting years ago. Because there had never once been anybody standing on the other side of the door to knock. Somebody was knocking now, from 40 years back, from a hand long since stilled, and Bryda Calder, who had built her whole life around the plain, hard-earned belief that she was the only person the world had ever built too small a door for, sat with that belief cracking slowly open in her lap, page by faded page, and understood, with a certainty that reached down into some old place she'd stopped trusting a long time ago, that she had been wrong. Somebody once, long before she was born, had built a bigger door, on purpose, for someone exactly like her. She sat with that for a long while, letting it settle into her the way heat from the stove had finally settled into her bones. 21 years she had carried the plain, hard-earned belief that her size was a debt the world had never agreed to and would never forgive her for owing. 21 years of ducking and altering and being paid and left quick, and telling herself that a woman who needed nobody could never be disappointed by anybody. And here, in the dark in a stranger's cabin, she had only found because a storm had nearly killed her. That belief had cracked open, like river ice in a spring thaw, not all at once, but page by faded page, letter by patient letter, until she could no longer entirely remember what shape it used to hold. She did not yet know what had become of the boy who'd needed a bigger door, whether he'd grown old in this hollow or grown up and gone, or met some end the letters hadn't reached yet. She only knew that somewhere in this bundle, folded and refolded 100 times, by hands long since stilled, was the answer to a question she had been asking the dark for 21 years without once expecting a reply. She lifted the next letter with hands that had at last stopped shaking from the cold and started shaking instead from something else entirely, and outside, the storm went on hammering its long, patient complaint against the mountain, as if it, too, understood that the night was not nearly finished with Bryda Calder yet. The bundle had never once been sorted by date. Bryda understood that now, working her way deeper into it, these were letters refolded and reshuffled 100 times over 40 years by hands that had loved them more than they'd organized them, so that a page written when Rowan was already a grown man might sit folded up against a page written before he'd learned to walk straight through a doorway. She had been reading a life out of order the way a person sometimes has to, piecing the shape of it together backward and forward at once. The next letter she drew out was dated the 17th of October. Bryda noticed the date before she noticed anything else on the page. Noticed it the way a person notices a name called out in a crowded room. Sharp, sudden, impossible to mistake for noise. The 17th of October, her own birthday. The day she was sitting in this very room, 21 years old, reading a stranger's mail by firelight while a storm tried its level best to bury her. She told herself it meant nothing. Dates repeated. There were only so many days in a year, and half the territory had been born on one of them, same as her. Coincidence was just arithmetic, wearing a spookier coat. Except her hands had gone still on the page, and her heart hadn't caught up yet to whatever her hands already suspected. We came into this hollow on the 17th of October, the letter read, with nothing but the wagon and what we could carry, and my back turned on a town that had already made up its mind about my son before he'd said one word to prove it wrong. Nettie did not weep on the road up. She waited until we'd unloaded the wagon, and I'd gone to see about water, and I came back to find her sitting on the tailboard, crying the way a person cries when they've been holding it in for 3 days straight and finally run out of road. I did not ask her to stop. Some grief has earned the right to finish itself. Bryda read it twice through, because it was one thing to learn a family had built a bigger door for a boy the world refused to make room for. It was another thing entirely to learn the exact day they'd done it, the exact date stamped into the wound, same as it was stamped into hers. She sat with that a long moment, the fire popping low behind her, and thought not for the first time tonight though maybe for the first time she let herself actually finish the thought, instead of flinching off it halfway through that perhaps a person's birthday wasn't only the day the world had forgotten to want them. Maybe it was also sometimes the day somebody else had finally decided to build a door wide enough. She kept reading. The letters right after that one turned smaller in their concerns, the way a family's letters do once the worst of a crisis has passed and ordinary life has crept back in to fill the space it left behind. Rowan did not take to the hollow easy, one entry admitted. He missed the schoolhouse more than he let on, and there was a girl there he'd been sweet on from a distance and never once worked up the nerve to speak to. And Nettie says that's a grief all its own. Being run off from a place before you've had the chance to fail at something on your own account instead of failing at them passionate because of how God built you. Brida's chest tightened reading that, because she knew that grief too, in her own way, not the girl, not the schoolhouse, but the shape underneath it. The way a person could be denied even the ordinary right to be disappointed by ordinary things, because the extraordinary thing about you had already crowded every other possibility clean out of the room before you'd had a chance to try it. He came around to the hollow. Eventually, the letter went on. Took to the work of it. Said once, and only once, that a man could build himself a life out here that nobody would ever again have cause to vote on. I did not ask him to explain what he meant by that. I understood it well enough on my own. There were fewer letters after that, spaced further apart. The way letters written by people, no longer feeling the same urgency, to set every day down on paper, tend to thin out over time. A note about Rowan taking up carpentry proper, building doors and furniture on commission, for families 2 days ride off who did not care what size a man was so long as his joints held true. A note about Nettie's health beginning to trouble her, a cough that came with the cold weather, and lingered longer each year than the year before. And then, 3 letters from the very bottom of the bundle, one that made Brida's breath catch clean in her throat. Rowan has gone down to Coldwater Flat. It read in Ezra's hand, shakier now, the letters less certain of themselves than they'd once been. Word reached us there's a woman there running a wheelwright's shop since her father passed, and needing a man handy enough to keep it running, and not troubled in the slightest, so the word says, by the man doing the keeping. I told him to go. Nettie cried again, the good kind this time, and told him if he came home without at least trying, he needn't come home at all, which is the fiercest threat I have ever heard my wife make, and the first time I have ever heard her mean a threat as a kindness. Brida set the letter down with hands gone entirely still, because that was the shape of a life continuing, a door opening somewhere past this hollow, past this cabin, into a world Brida herself had never once been offered a glimpse of a woman, unbothered by size, needing exactly the kind of man the rest of the world had spent a lifetime being troubled by. She did not know, yet, whether Rowan had found that door and walked through it, or whether the story stopped short of the ending she wanted for him. The letters thinned out fast after that one, and she had not reached the bottom of the bundle. She told herself she would. Later, when her hands had stopped shaking long enough to trust them with anything so fragile as an ending. The next several letters filled in the shape of what they'd fled. Wren's Landing. The town was called a name Brida had never once heard spoken in Ashford Creek, which told her nothing, because towns died out here all the time and took their names with them. Good Bottomland. A creek that never ran dry even in the driest years. A congregation, a schoolhouse, a life the letters described in the plain, unadorned way. People described things they missed too much to dress up with better words. And then, 3 letters later, in Ezra's hand gone tight and careful, in a way it hadn't been. Before there is a man in Wren's Landing named Barnabas Vale who has decided our claim suits him better than it suits us. He came to me first with an offer, which I refused, being that the offer amounted to 1/3 of what the land was worth, and twice what he could otherwise have gotten it for honest. When I refused a second time, he stopped smiling at me in the street, which I did not mind, and started smiling at other men in the street when my name came up, which I minded a great deal more. Brida's stomach went cold before her mind had finished catching up to why. Vale. She read on faster now, her big hands not quite steady on the brittle paper. It began as talk. That is how these things always begin, I have come to learn, though I did not know it at the time. Her remark here about how a boy built the way Rowan is built might not be entirely natural. A question there about whether a family raising such a child ought to be trusted with good bottomland when there were other, more ordinary families who might make better use of it. Barnabas Vale did not say these things himself. He is too careful a man for that. He let other men say them, and stood nearby looking troubled on our behalf. And within 2 months there were women in that town who would not let their own children walk past our fence, and a deacon who suggested from the pulpit, without naming us outright, that some families invite trial upon themselves through sins we need not speak of directly. Brida set the letter down, picked it back up. Read the last line again. Sins we need not speak of directly. She knew that sentence. Not those exact words, but the shape of them, the small, familiar cowardice of a person who wanted to accuse us without ever once having to stand behind the accusation. She had heard versions of it her whole life, dressed in different clothes, delivered by different mouths, and it had always landed the same way, like a slap disguised as a sigh. We left before it turned to something worse than talk. The letter went on. I do not know that it would have. I was not willing to find out with my son's life as the wager. There was one more letter on the subject, tucked just behind that one. Shorter, the hand less steady than Ezra's usual careful lines. I went to see Barnabas Vale before we left. Told him plain I knew what he was about, and that I'd rather he say it to my face than keep saying it to every man in town behind mine. He did not deny it. That was the thing that stayed with me longest, riding home that night. He did not even trouble himself to deny it. He said, and I set this down exact, because I want it remembered exact. You'll go easier if you go now, Marrow, than if you make me a reason to help you along. I have turned that sentence over 100 times since. A man does not threaten another man's family over a piece of ground unless he believes, in his bones, that nobody will ever ask him to answer for it. I mean to prove him wrong about that, someday, if not in my own lifetime, then in whoever's hands this letter comes to rest. Brida sat with that a long moment, the fire ticking low behind her, because there it was, 40 years old and still sharp enough to cut. A promise made to nobody in particular, addressed to whatever stranger the future might someday deliver to this exact room. And here she was, the stranger, holding a challenge a dead man had thrown forward across 4 decades of silence, not knowing whether anybody would ever be standing close enough to catch it. So we came up into this hollow, where the ground was harder, and the winters longer, and nobody had thought to want it yet. And I proved up the claim in full and lawful order within the year, because I had learned, by then, that a man's rights mean very little if he cannot produce the paper that proves them. Brida looked up from the page into the dark corners of the little room, as though the walls themselves might have something further to add. Because Vale. Because that name, spoken not 40 years ago, but 3 days back, across a mercantile counter, from a mouth that smiled without its eyes ever joining in. Because Corwin Vale had stood in that store and talked about ground a man could acquire, if he knew which parcels and moved quick, and here was a letter 40 years old, describing his own father doing the exact same thing to the exact same family in the exact same range of mountains, which meant this wasn't a new kind of hunger. It was an inherited one. She found the loose floorboard near midnight, or near what she judged to be midnight, having lost all other way of marking the hour. Ezra had hidden the letters in a drawer beneath the bench. A careful man does not put his 2 greatest treasures in the very same place, where one discovery yields both, but a careful man might well put them close together, in a spot he thought of as the heart of the house, so that whoever found the one might be led, eventually, to look for the other. She pressed her palms flat along the floorboards fronting the bench and worked her way outward, testing each plank for the give and the hollow note that had already betrayed the drawer once. Most were solid, nailed fast to the joists beneath. But near the base of the bench, where a person kneeling to draw out letters would naturally rest their weight, one board sat a hair proud of its neighbors. She pressed it. The far end lifted just slightly, on a pivot she couldn't see. Her heart climbed all over again. She worked her fingers into the seam, and the board came up, and beneath it, sunk into a cavity between the joists, lined with oilcloth against the damp, lay a second bundle, and beside it, wrapped separately, small and heavy that clunked and unmistakable, as her fingers brushed against it. She lifted both into the light. The wrapped weight she opened first, and found inside it a leather pouch gone stiff with age. When she loosened the drawstring and tipped it into her palm, coins slid out. Gold. A small, heavy stream of them, more money than she had ever seen gathered in one place in her whole life. She sat back on her heels with the gold cold and bright in her hand and felt the old shameful hope leap up in her before she could stop it. And then she looked at the second bundle, the flat one, wrapped in the same oilcloth, and knew, before she'd even opened it, that this was the thing that mattered. The gold was only the guard standing watch over it. She set the coins carefully aside, unwrapped the flat bundle, and there it was, exactly as the letters had been building toward the whole night, a single, large sheet of heavy paper, folded once, its surface crowded with formal script, and at its foot, the impressed seal of the General Land Office of the United States, the raised device still crisp beneath her fingertips after all these years. The patent, proved up, signed, sealed. True, the thing a man had feared for more than his own life, and had hidden from a thief, and had trusted to whatever future hands might someday come looking for it. She held it a long moment, and thought of every letter she'd read that night, every ordinary worry about roofs and firewood and frost on the beans, all of it building steadily toward this one document, the way a whole life sometimes builds toward a single decision made in the dark, alone, with everything at stake. Ezra Marrow had not hidden gold to make his son rich. He had hidden a piece of paper to make sure nobody could ever again tell his son he didn't belong somewhere. She understood that now in a way she suspected she wouldn't have understood it quite so completely 3 hours earlier. Before the coat on the peg, and the doorway that didn't require her to duck, and the bunk built long enough for a body like hers. She was still holding it, kneeling on the cold floor with the deed in her hands and the gold at her knee, when she heard the sound that did not belong. Faint, muffled by snow and timber, but there, and wrong, because it was the sound of the world of men, where no world of men should have been able to reach her. Voices, more than one, and beneath them the crunch and squeak of boots breaking through frozen crust, coming closer. She did not move for the space of 3 breaths, which was, she would think later, the exact wrong amount of time to spend deciding anything, and also the only amount of time she had. Then she moved fast, because there was no version of tonight where being caught here, deed in hand, ended well, and she had exactly one advantage, and she meant to use every ounce of it while it still belonged to her. She wrapped the deed back into its oilcloth and shoved it deep into her satchel, buried beneath the mended coat she'd never delivered. The gold went in after it, packed tight against the bottom seam, and the bundle of letters went in on top, gathered up loose and unfolded, no time left to tie them proper. She was reaching for her shawl when the light through the window shifted a shadow passing across it, and she froze where she stood. The door, which she'd left unlatched against the heat of the fire, swung inward on its own complaint. A man filled the frame, broad, slow-moving, dressed for hard country, snow crusted thick along his shoulders, and he looked at Bryda the way a man looks at something he did not expect to find and has not yet decided the use of. Behind him came a second shape, thinner, and the moment his face caught the firelight, Bryda's stomach dropped clean through the floor, because she knew that sharp jaw, that easy lean. Dallin Vale. Well, the broad one said, and the single word carried a whole disposition in it, unfriendly, and not the least bit surprised. Somebody's home after all. Bryda's mind went very clear, the way it had gone clear out in the storm. Fear burning off into a cold, bright kind of attention. Except there was no pretending her way out of this one. She knew that before either man had said another word, a smaller woman caught here alone might have folded herself down into something harmless-looking, something a man's eyes slid right past. Bryda had never once in her life had that door open to her. Her size announced itself before she'd said a single word, the same way it always had, and there was no shrinking down from it now, in a cabin lit gold by a fire she'd built with her own 2 hands. Lost in the storm, she said anyway, because it was at least half true, and true things were easier to hold steady in your voice. Snow drove me up here. That a fact. Dallin's eyes went past her, to the raised plank by the bench, to the disturbed floor she hadn't had time to set right. In a cabin nobody's lived in since before either of us was born. Awful specific place for the storm to drive a person's. Storms aren't known for their manners, no, the broad one said. Neither are we. He stepped further in, ducking under a lintel that hadn't once required Bryda to duck at all, and something about that, his stoop against her own straight-backed height, seemed to settle a decision in him. My brother's man, this is. Name's Bogue, and you'd want to know who you're dealing with, so I'll spare us both the trouble. Mr. Corwin Vale has a legal interest in this ground. Inside the week, He'll have a great deal more than an interest. It's not his ground. Records say otherwise. Records lie when a man pays them to. Bogue's mouth did something that was not quite a smile. Careful now. I generally am. Dallin had crossed to the hearth while they talked, crouching to look into the raised cavity in the floor, and when he straightened, whatever patience he'd been wearing had gone out of him entirely. There was something in that hole, he said. It's not there now, which means it's either already gone, or it's on you. And I'd rather not find out the hard way which. You could ask nicely. I could. He took a step closer, close enough that Brita had to tip her chin down to keep his eyes level with hers, a fact that seemed to bother him considerably more than it bothered her. I don't generally find it necessary. Must be a comfortable way to go through life. It is as it happens. Enjoy it while it lasts. Something flickered behind Dallin's eyes. Not quite anger. Closer to the offense of a man unused to being answered back by anybody, let alone by a woman built to look him level in the face. While she did it, he glanced at Bogue, some silent instruction passing between them that needed no translating. Search the satchel, Dallin said. I'll not have my things gone through by a man I've known 10 minutes. You'll not have much say in it either way. Bogue moved first, and Brita stepped back, putting the bench between them, buying herself the one thing she needed most, which was a few seconds to think instead of react. Brita did not answer that further. Her satchel sat behind her on the bench, close enough to reach, too far to protect, and every plan her mind reached for collapsed the second it touched the plain fact of her own size, standing between her and any hope of slipping past them unnoticed, which left her exactly one thing she had that they didn't. The roof over their heads had a foot and more of snow packed onto it, old snow gone heavy and wet where the stovepipe had been melting it from below for hours now. And Brita had spent enough winters in this territory to know the grown snow makes right before it decides to let go of whatever it's been clinging to. She heard it now, faint, almost lost under Bogue's voice, a long, low shifting. Directly overhead, she said, We'll want to search you first. Suit yourselves. She looked up, deliberate, slow, and let her eyes go wide with something that was not this time an act. But that roof's been groaning since you walked in. And I've heard enough snowslides in my life to know the sound one makes right before it comes down. For 1/2 of 1 second, neither man moved. Then the roof answered for her. It was not the great burying collapse of a mountainside letting go she had judged it right. The wet snow shifting off the steep pitch above the door in one heavy sliding rush. Not the whole roof, only the built-up weight along the eave, but it came down fast and loud and close. A wall of white crashing past the open door, and Bogue threw an arm up over his face on instinct, staggering back a full step, and Dallin swore and ducked away from the doorway entirely. Brita did not wait to see what either man did next. She caught up her satchel in one hand, hauled her shawl half over her shoulder with the other, and went out the cabin's rear window, a low opening never meant for a door but plenty wide enough for her. Once the shutter came off its single hinge under one hard shove into the driving dark beyond, snow already swallowing the sound of her own boots behind her. She did not run blind. She ran the one direction she was certain of, because certain of it or not, she had chosen it 3 hours before, and it had not yet killed her downhill, toward the ravine, toward the trail that had to, eventually spit her back out into a world that knew her name. Behind her, muffled by snow and distance both, she heard Bogue shouting something that might have been her direction, and might have been nothing but noise, and she did not look back to find out which. The trail found the shelf of rock above the ravine sometime past what felt like the darkest hour of the night, the one that comes right before a storm finally starts to loosen its grip, though it hadn't loosened its grip yet, not by any measure Brita could see. A rope bridge old, badly kept, 3 planks wide in places and 1 plank wide in others, spanned the gap, where the ravine narrowed enough for a person to cross without climbing all the way down and back up again. She had seen bridges like it before, strung by trappers and never once maintained by anybody after, boards silvered and split, rope rails gone furred with ice. She stood at its near end a long moment with the wind, trying to shove her sideways off the ledge, doing the arithmetic she did not want to do, because the bridge had been built for ordinary weight, ordinary boots, an ordinary body crossing an ordinary gap the way ordinary bodies had crossed it for however many years it had hung there. And she was not ordinary, in exactly the one way that mattered most right now, standing at the edge of a drop the storm wouldn't even let her judge the depth of. She did not have another road. That was the whole of the decision, when she finally let herself look at it plain. Behind her, somewhere in the dark and the snow, were two men who knew she was carrying something worth searching for. Below her, a drop the storm wouldn't let her judge the bottom of. Ahead, one bad bridge, and, past it, the slope that eventually became the creek road and eventually became home. She went slow, testing each board before she trusted her full weight to it, her hands gripping the frozen rope rails hard enough to burn. She was perhaps 2/3 across when the plank beneath her right boot gave a crack that traveled up through her whole leg before her mind had even finished registering the sound, and the board snapped clean through, and her foot dropped into nothing. For one endless, silent second, Bryda Calder hung above a black gap in the earth, one hand locked white-knuckled around a rope rail that was itself beginning to fray loose from its anchor on the far side, her satchel the deed, the gold, the whole of a dead man's trust swinging wild from her other shoulder. She did not scream. There was no breath in her to spare for it. She swung her free arm up, caught the rail with both hands, and hauled herself sideways, boots scrabbling for a plank that would hold, and found one, and threw her whole weight onto it before she'd let herself fully believe it would take the strain. It held. She did not move again for 3 full breaths, chest heaving, snow driving sideways into a face gone numb past feeling. Below her, somewhere in the black, she heard the plank she'd lost strike rock, once, twice, and then nothing, swallowed whole by the dark, and she made herself not think too hard about how easily that could have been the sound of something other than a plank, because it very nearly had been, which was not a thought worth keeping company with out here, alone, with half a bridge still left to cross. When she finally trusted her legs to carry her, she went the rest of the way across on her hands and knees, distributing her weight the way she'd have distributed a heavy load across a wagon bed, spreading the danger thin instead of letting it gather all in one place. She came off the far end of that bridge into a snowbank and lay there one moment longer than pride generally allowed her, and thought, with the strange clarity exhaustion sometimes hands a person for free, a smaller woman would have crossed that bridge without a second thought, and I very nearly didn't cross it at all. Then she got up, because lying in a snowbank had never once solved anything, and she still had a long way left to walk before this night let her go. She came into Ashford Creek long after full dark, a snow-caked shape staggering out of white into the yellow smear of the saloon windows, and she went not to the boarding house and her own cold attic room, but straight through the empty street to the one house, where a light still burned the small frame house behind the assay office, where the county's land recorder kept his rooms. Abram Quill was a spare, gray, careful man who had held his post in Caldera County for 11 years and had earned, in that time, a reputation rare enough in this territory to be worth something. He was honest. Plainly, stubbornly, inconveniently honest, in a way that had cost him more than one friendship, and never once cost him a night's sleep over it. He opened his door to her hammering fist with a lamp raised high, and whatever he'd expected to find on his step at this hour, it was plainly not a woman 2 heads taller than himself, soaked through and swaying, snow-packed solid into the folds of her shawl. "Good Lord," he said, and had an arm under hers before she could get a single word out, drawing her in out of the wind with a strength that surprised her, coming from a man built along such ordinary lines. "You'll die of the cold standing there talking about it. Come in. Come in, now." He sat her by his stove, pressed a cup of something hot into her hands, and did not ask his questions until the worst of the shaking had passed. By then, Bryda had already decided how much of the night, to give him all of it. She told it plain, the way Ezra Merrow had written it, the walk up the mountain, the storm, the wagon cabin buried in its hollow that no map had ever shown her, the letters, the family that had lived and loved and finally died there, 40 years gone. And then, drawing the oilcloth packet from inside her satchel with hands that had only just begun to properly warm, she told him of the deed and laid it open on his table beneath the lamp. Quill did not touch it at first. He bent over it, hands clasped behind his back, the way a man approaches something he is half afraid to believe, and read it through twice by lamplight, lips moving faintly over the legal phrasing. When he straightened, his face had changed entirely. "This is a patent," he said low, as much to himself as to her. "A land patent proved up and sealed under the General Land Office, for a claim in the Ironvin Range." He looked up at her, sharp. Do you have any notion what you're holding? Ezra Marrows writes. Whole and lawful. More than that. Quill's mouth thinned. A patent is the end of the line, Miss Calder. It's the government itself declaring that ground belongs to this man, free and clear forever. There's no higher paper. Nothing beats it. He rubbed his gray face, and something like dread moved behind his eyes. Nothing but its absence, which is precisely what makes it worth killing for. Bryda set her cup down. There's a man. Means to take that ground. Corwin Vale, his brother and another man, were up at the cabin tonight, tearing up the floor, looking for exactly what I'm carrying. Quill's expression curdled at the name, the look of a man who has heard something recently that he wishes he hadn't. Vale filed a petition. 3 weeks passed, he said slowly, crossing to a shelf crowded with ledgers, drawing one down, laying it open beside the deed. Tax title. Claims the unvan ground lapsed, owner to deceased, taxes unpaid, no heir of record. His finger found a line in his own neat hand. I entered it myself, didn't think much of it at the time. Half this territory's full of claims. Exactly like it. Old. Abandoned. Nobody left to mind them. He's not only after the ground, Bryda said. There's talk of ore, iron, maybe silver, under those folds. Railroads set to run through the pass, and he means to own what's under it before anybody else thinks to look. Quill went very still. That, he said, would explain a great deal I hadn't been able to make sense of. He tapped the assessor's ledger, frowning hard now. There's been a surveyor through this county twice this year, filing nothing public, asking careful questions about mineral rights on lapsed claims. I'd taken it for ordinary railroad business. I don't take it for that anymore. He looked at her, and the warmth that had been in his face when he'd pulled her in out of the storm had gone somewhere else entirely, replaced by the flat gravity of a man doing hard arithmetic and not liking the sum. This is not going to be a simple thing to win, Miss Calder, he said. Not the ground. And not, I think you stand up to it claim belongs to somebody besides Corwin Vale. I don't want the ground. No, Quill said. But somebody's going to have to stand in a room and say who does. And I'll tell you plain, because I'd be doing you a disservice not to. There are men in this territory who will look at you standing in that room before they've heard one word you have to say and decide already what your word is worth. They've been doing that to me my whole life, Mr. Quill. I've managed to keep standing anyway. This will be a harder version of it than you've faced. He said it gently, but he said it plain, the way an honest man delivers bad weather to somebody who needs to hear it, regardless of whether they want to. There's an old statute on the territorial books. Predates the county, predates most of the men who'd have to enforce it. I've only had cause to look it up twice in 11 years, and both times it turned my stomach. It gives a court latitude to weigh a witness's. He paused, choosing the word with visible distaste, bodily confirmation, in judging the reliability of testimony. It was written with an eye toward men who'd lost their wits, or their sight, or some other failing that might honestly cloud a man's account of what he'd seen. It was never written with you in mind. But it is not written narrowly either, and a clever lawyer can walk a law like that, anywhere he pleases if nobody's standing in the doorway to stop him. Bryda sat with that a long moment, the cup gone cold in her hands. So a man can steal a mountain, she said, and the only witness standing between him and it can be talked out of the room on account of how tall she is. I did not say it was just, Quill said. I said it was possible. There's a considerable difference, and I mean to spend what time we have narrowing that difference, as much as the law will allow me to. And if it isn't enough, Quill did not answer that one right away. He looked instead at the deed on the table between them, at the seal pressed into it 40 years back by a government that had never once met the man it belonged to. And when he finally spoke, his voice had gone quieter, steadier, the voice of a man committing himself out loud to something he hadn't quite finished deciding in private. Then we find more than one witness, he said. A dead man's word on paper is a start. It is not on its own going to be enough to stand against Corwin Vale in a room full of men predisposed to doubt the woman holding it. But a family Miss Calder blood, living blood, standing up to claim what's theirs, that is a different weight of evidence altogether, and no statute on any book I've read has yet found a way to strike that kind of witness from a room. You think there's family left? I think, Quill said, that a man who prayed every night that his son wasn't the only one of his kind on this earth was not a man who raised that son to vanish without a trace. Whether there's a line of it left to find, I couldn't tell you tonight, but I mean to look, and I'd be glad of your help doing it, if you're willing to give it, once you've slept a proper night and stopped looking like the storm nearly finished what it started. Outside, the wind had not once let up, and Bryda Calder sat very still by a stranger's stove, the deed on the table between them, and understood that the storm she'd walked through tonight had only been the first one. She thought of the coat on the peg, sized for shoulders like her own, of the doorway she hadn't had to duck through, of a man named Rowan who'd walked down to Coldwater Flat chasing a door that might, or might not, still be standing open for him somewhere. She did not know his ending yet. She meant to find it, not only because a dead man's letters had asked her to, and not only because Corwin Vale's father had once made a promise to nobody in particular that somebody, someday, would make him answer for what he'd done, though both of those reasons sat heavy enough on their own. She meant to find it because, for the first time in 21 years, Bryda Calder had been handed proof that somewhere, out past the edge of everything she'd ever known to be true about herself, there had once lived a person who understood exactly, precisely, without needing a single word of explanation, what it cost a body her size to walk through an ordinary day in an ordinary town built for somebody else's shoulders. She was not going to let that proof go cold. Not tonight. Not for anything Corwin Vale, or his brother, or the whole weight of a crooked law book had left to throw at her. Quill banked his own stove for the night and showed her to a narrow cot in the front room, too short for her by a full foot and a half, and she lay on it anyway, with her knees drawn up and her satchel clutched against her chest like it might try to leave without her, and somewhere in the last hour before dawn, exhausted, past the point of fighting it any longer, Bryda Calder finally slept and dreamed, for the first time she could remember in all her 21 years, of a door built exactly her size, standing open, with somebody on the other side of it who already knew her name. She found Rowan's own letter at first light, near the very bottom of the bundle, and knew it for his the second her eyes touched the hand bolder than his father's, less careful than his mother's, the hand of a man who had learned to write late and write big, the way a body writes when it has never once had cause to make itself small on paper, the way it made itself small everywhere else. It was not dated. It did not need to be. If you are reading this, it began, and are built the way I am built, then I want you to say something nobody ever once thought to tell me, and I have decided, since nobody else will do it, that I had better do it myself. Bryda sat very still on Quill's narrow cot, the gray morning light barely strong enough yet to read by, and kept going. You did not arrive wrong. Whatever this world has told you, in whatever town raised you, however many doors you have had to duck through, or chairs you have had to test twice before trusting your weight to them, you did not arrive wrong. The door was built wrong. Not you. I am leaving this place soon. For a woman I mean to marry who never once looked at me the way this whole territory has taught me to expect a person to look. I do not know if I will come back to this hollow. I do not know if anyone of my blood ever will. But my father built a door here that fits a body like ours, and I cannot carry a door with me down the mountain, so I am leaving it standing, in the hope that the next person who needs it finds it before the weather does. Whoever you are, however you got here, you are welcome in this house. Bryda folded the letter along its old crease with hands that had gone, for the third time in 2 days, entirely unsteady, and did not try to explain to herself why. Because it was one thing to learn a dead man had built a bigger door for his son. It was another thing entirely to learn that the son himself, grown and gone from this cabin, had turned around before he left and built something back, not out of timber this time, but out of plain, unadorned words, addressed to nobody in particular and everybody exactly like him. She simply folded it and set it apart from the others, and knew, the way she'd known very few things in her whole life with this particular certainty, that she was going to need it again before this was finished. Corwin Vale came to Quill's house before the morning was even properly done with itself. He came alone, which surprised her, no Dallin, no Bogue trailing at his shoulder, just the man himself brushing snow from a coat too fine for the weather, stepping into Quill's front room unhurried, easy, like somebody who has never once doubted a door would open for him. It opened. Quill had no lawful way to keep it shut. Vale's gaze found Bryda at the table, found the deed still lying open beneath the lamp, and something moved behind his eyes, not surprise, she noted. Recalculation. The look of a man rearranging his figures after a bad piece of news. You've been busy, he said. I have. My brother described a frightened girl weeping over old letters in a cabin. I confess the woman sitting in front of me looks considerably less frightened than advertised. Your brother should look harder before he reports back. Something flickered at the corner of Vale's mouth. Not quite a smile. I'll confess I'm impressed, he said. Genuinely. It's not every day a man's plans are troubled by somebody twice the size of the trouble he expected. Is that meant as an insult, Vale? It's meant as arithmetic. I find most things in this life come down to arithmetic, sooner or later, however people prefer to dress it up otherwise. Then let's do some. Bryda folded her hands on the table, deliberate, unhurried, matching him at his own game. You've a petition before the county board, built on a claim that never lapsed, which makes your petition a lie standing on paper, however good the paper looks. A lie is a strong word for an honest misunderstanding. Your father made the same honest misunderstanding 40 years back. Ran a family off good bottomland with talk he never once had the nerve to say to their faces. I'd call that a family trade, Mr. Vale. If I were being generous. I'm not feeling especially generous this morning. For the first time since he'd walked through the door, something genuine crossed Vale's face. Not something closer to respect, grudging, and entirely unwanted, the look of a man realizing the game had changed shape without his permission. I'm a practical man, he said finally. I bear you no particular ill will, Miss Calder. You found something valuable. That's worth something on its own account. I'll give you $300 cash for that paper and your silence, and you can walk out of this territory today, wealthier than you've ever once been in your life. That's a great deal of money for a lie you claim isn't one. Call it generosity, then, if the word suits you better. Generosity doesn't usually arrive with a threat folded up inside it. Only arithmetic, same as before. Vale leaned back, unhurried, a man laying his cards down one at a time because he enjoyed the watching as much as the winning. $300 is more than you'll see mending shirts in this territory the whole rest of your natural life. I'd think a woman in your position might value a sure thing over a fight she's like to lose regardless. And if I don't, then you'll stand up tomorrow in front of the whole county board, and my lawyer will take you apart plainly and pleasantly in front of every soul in that room. He'll ask how a woman with no family, no standing, and no witness to anything she claims came to be carrying a dead man's deed. He'll ask what else went missing from that cabin. Gold, perhaps. His eyes held hers, cold, almost kind in their cruelty. The cruelty of a man who has done his homework thoroughly, and there will not be one soul in that room to say you're wrong. Because you don't have one soul standing behind you. You never have. The words found every old wound with the precision of a man who has made a careful study of exactly where they lie. Bryda let the silence sit a moment before she answered. Because he had earned that much, at least the weight, the not knowing which way she'd land. You're wrong about one thing, she said finally, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake at all. You think being alone your whole life makes a person easy to break, but a woman who's had nothing has already survived losing everything, over and over every single day of her life. You've got a great deal to protect, Mr. Vale. Money. Standing. A name people still say out loud with any respect left in it. I've got a dead man's trust, and a letter from his son telling me I belong somewhere. That's the one thing you cannot buy off me, because it's the first thing anybody's ever given me that was worth having. She slid the $300 he hadn't yet offered, imagined, unspoken, already refused back across the table with a look instead of a hand, because there was nothing on the table yet to push. Keep your money, she said. I'll see you at the board. Something shut behind Vale's eyes, the door of a man deciding finally that charm had run its course. He gathered his coat, wound his scarf with slow, deliberate care, and at Quill's own door he paused and looked back at her, the pleasant mask gone entirely now. You've made a poor trade, he told her. Tomorrow you'll understand exactly how poor. There's no shame in a woman like you losing to a man like me. It's only the natural order of things. He opened the door onto the cold. But there's a great deal of shame in choosing to lose when you were handed a way out. That shame you'll carry alone, the way you carry everything. Then he was gone into the snow, and Bryda sat in the ringing quiet that followed, and understood that she had just refused the only sure thing anybody had ever offered her. In trade for a fight she was not at all certain she could win. We have today, Quill said, once the door had shut, and tonight. If there is a living heir of Ezra Marrow anywhere in this territory, we need some trace of them before that board convenes tomorrow. or Vale's lie carries the day regardless of what paper we bring. He pulled down the oldest of his record books, the ones bound in cracked leather, pages gone soft and foxed with age, and set them in a stack that reached nearly to Brida's chin even seated. Rowan Marrow went down to Coldwater Flat, Brida said. The letters say as much. Married a widow there who ran a wheelwright's shop. Coldwater Flat's not in this county. But the marriage would have been recorded somewhere if it happened at all, and recorded marriages tend to leave a trail even when the people in them don't. Quill was already turning pages. Fast. Practiced. What was her name? The widow. The letters don't say. Only that she wasn't troubled by his size. That narrows it down considerably less than I'd like. They read through the short gray afternoon, and into lamplit evening the two of them bent over crumbling books, while the town went quiet under fresh snow outside. For a long while they found nothing but the ordinary sad arithmetic of a hard country: births, marriages, deaths, claims filed and claims abandoned, none of them touching the name Marrow at all, until Quill's finger stopped on a line that made him sit up sharp. Here, he said. Marrow. But he frowned, reading it again. This can't be right. Says here a Josiah Marrow. File a claim near Wren's Landing. Same year your letters mention the family fleeing north. If this is the same family, Brida leaned over the book so fast the bench creaked beneath her. It isn't. You're certain it's the right name, the right year, the right corner of the territory. The father's name was Ezra, not Josiah. She kept her finger pressed flat against the line, as though holding the page still might somehow make it tell the truth faster. Different family. Same surname. Wrong man entirely. There must be more than one Marrow ever to cross this territory. Quill exhaled, long and frustrated, rubbing at his temples with both hands. We've lost the better of an hour chasing the wrong Marrow, and I haven't got an hour to spare tonight, Miss Calder, let alone a spare family. We haven't lost it. She said it steadier than she felt, because somebody in that room needed to sound certain, and Quill, for the first time since she'd met him, looked genuinely close to giving up on the whole endeavor. Narrowed the field. It isn't this Josiah, which means whatever's true is still out there waiting on us, and sitting here regretting the hour won't bring it any closer. You're a great deal more patient than I am, this late at night. I've had more practice being patient than most people ever want. Quill managed something that was almost a laugh, tired and short, and pulled the next volume down from the shelf. Try Coldwater Flat Records Direct, Brida said. Not this county's book. Theirs. I don't hold their records here. Then we ride for them. It was Quill who found it, near midnight, in a water-stained volume of early marriage records that had come to Ashford Creek years back in a box of county papers nobody had ever properly sorted, and he read the line aloud twice before either of them trusted it. Rowan Marrow, of the Ironvin claim to Sable Thorncroft of Coldwater Flat, recorded the autumn of 1826. He married, Brida said. He truly married. And if they had children, Quill was already pulling the next volume, hands quick despite the hour. A wheelwright's widow, remarried. There'd be a daughter's name somewhere, a granddaughter's, if the line carried forward at all. It took another hour. It felt to Brida like it took the whole remaining span of the night, though the clock on Quill's mantle insisted otherwise. But near 2 in the morning, in a slim register of baptisms nobody had opened in a decade, they found it. A daughter, Talitha Marrow, born to Rowan and Sable, in the spring of 1829, and beneath that, in a different hand, added years later Talitha Marrow, married to a Finn, of Coleridge. Quill was already pulling a county gazetteer down beside the register, running one finger down a list of households he plainly knew better than he'd let on. Coleridge is close, he said. Close enough a woman might have stayed near where she was raised, if her mother's people were kind to her. There's only the one Fenn family on that road that I've ever had cause to record anything for. Land tax. A stillbirth notice years back, and a christening after it that took. He looked up at her, and in his tired, gray eyes was the first real hope Brida had seen in him since she'd hammered on his door the night before. There's a Fenn family out on the Coleridge Road, he said. Keeps to themselves. I've never had cause to wonder where they came from before tonight, then we've a cause now. It's the middle of the night, Miss Calder. The board meets at 10. I'll take the middle of the night over no time at all. The Fenn place was a low, snug cabin, with smoke standing straight up from its chimney into a sky finally gone still and clear. When Quill's knock brought a lamp to the window, and then to the door, It was a woman near Brida's own age who opened it, sturdy, plain-faced flower, still dusted pale across her apron from some baking that couldn't wait for morning either, blinking at her midnight callers with more curiosity than alarm. Cora Fenn. Brida did not wait for Quill to explain anything.
Mrs. Fenn.
I'm sorry to come at this hour, but it can't wait for a decent one. Was your grandmother named Talitha? Talitha Marrow, whose father built a cabin in the iron vein range from an old freight wagon, by a spring that never froze? Cora Fenn went very still in her own doorway. My grandmother, she said slowly, used to tell of a spring that ran sweet all winter, when everything else in the country locked up solid with ice. Said her father built the whole shape of a life around it. Her hand rose to the frame, steadying herself. She said her father was the tallest man anybody in 3 counties had ever laid eyes on, taller than any door built to hold him. She loved him something fierce for it, though she never once said quite why, only that he'd taught her the world could be wrong about a person, and a person could still turn out entirely right, regardless. Her eyes, wet now, came up to find Brida's, and traveled the full unhidden height of her, taking in everything a lifetime of strangers' eyes usually only dared to take in sideways. You're built the same way, Cora said. Not a question. Something closer to recognition. I am. Then you already know why I'm crying, and I won't waste breath explaining it to you. She wiped her face with the back of one flowered hand, and something in her spine straightened all at once, the way a person straightens when deciding, right there on the spot, what kind of woman she means to be for the rest of a conversation. My grandmother's been gone 11 years now. I never once thought I'd meet anybody who could tell me what she meant by any of it. Come in out of the cold, both of you, and tell me the rest. All of it. I can see, plain enough, there's a great deal more to this visit than an old family story. They stepped inside, into a kitchen still warm from whatever Cora had been baking, and Josiah Fenn roused from bed, blanket over his shoulders, looking every bit as bewildered as a man had any right to look at that hour, pulled 2 more chairs to the table without being asked twice. They told her everything. In the warm lamplit kitchen, her husband roused and blanket-wrapped by the fire, listening without a word. They told her of the deed and gold, and Corwin Vale's forged claim of an heirless, lapsed inheritance. They told her of the board meeting in less than 8 hours, and what it would mean if nobody with marrow blood stood up in that room to prove the lie a lie. Cora Fenn heard all of it through without once interrupting, and when it was finished, she sat up very straight in her chair, and the tiredness fell clean off her voice. So this man says there's no heir left of my great-grandfather's blood, she said. Says it plain in his fine forged papers, does he? He does. Then tomorrow I'll go stand in front of the whole board and let him look at the heir he swore didn't exist. Her hand closed hard around the edge of the table. A man may lie on paper all he pleases. He cannot lie a living woman out of her own great-grandfather's ground, not while I've breath left to say otherwise. The county board met at 10 the next morning, in the long back room of the assay office, the only room in Ashford Creek, large enough to hold the county's business, and it filled to the walls. Because word had traveled through town overnight, the way word always travels in a place, with nothing better to do with its curiosity, and half of Ashford Creek had turned out to watch a giant woman stand against Corwin Vale, over ground in the mountains. Nobody there had ever once bothered to climb. Brida sat at the front, on a bench built for somebody half her size, the deed in its oilcloth on the table before her, and felt the whole weight of the room pressed against her back, the murmuring, the craning necks, every judgment she'd carried her entire life gathered now into one crowded space and aimed, all at once, in her direction. Across the aisle, Corwin Vale sat easy, a lawyer at his side in a good black coat. Mr. Sedgwick, by the look of him, unhurried, confident, a man who had clearly won more of these rooms than he'd ever lost. The chairman, a heavy, tired-faced rancher named Cyrus Dodd, called the matter the petition of a land company, represented by Corwin Vostell, for tax title upon the lapsed marrow claim in the Iron Vine Range. Sedgwick rose first and laid it out smooth as poured cream. Delinquent taxes, a long dead holder, a sworn assessor's certificate declaring no heir existed anywhere, the plain public virtue of putting waste ground back to honest use, rather than leaving it to rot under a dead man's forgotten name. Then Quill rose and placed the deed before the board, and explained plainly what it was: a patent, proved up, signed, sealed under the General Land Office, for ground that had never lapsed, never reverted, never once belonged to the county to sell. The murmur that moved through the room now carried a different note in it. Somewhere behind her, Bryda heard old Garrett Poole mutter something to his neighbor that sounded, unmistakably, like, "Well, I'll be," and she thought, absurdly, of the anvil, and how easy that lift had been compared to this one. Dodd bent over the deed with the other two board members, and Bryda watched the county's own official certificate begin to crumble against the plain weight of the government's older, harder seal, which was precisely when Sedgwick rose again, unhurried, smiling. "A remarkable paper," he allowed, strolling toward the board's table with his hands behind his back, "if genuine. But consider its source, gentlemen. Produced not from any courthouse, not passed down through any family, but discovered 2 nights past by this woman." He did not look at Bryda as he said it, which was, she thought, its own kind of insult, deliberate and precise alone, in an abandoned ruin, in a snowstorm, with no witness to any of it but herself. He turned to face her now, and his gaze was almost gentle, which made it worse. "I intend the lady no cruelty, but the board must ask itself plainly what it is being asked to believe." Further, and here his voice shifted, slowed, took on the careful weight of a man about to display his strongest. The territorial code affords this board latitude, in weighing testimony, to consider a witness's bodily conformation where it bears on the reliability of an account. I raise it only because fairness demands I raise it. A witness so singularly built, alone in a remote structure, in conditions of considerable stress and cold, her own perceptions, however honestly held, cannot be weighed the same as an ordinary witness's might be. A stir moved through the crowd. Bryda felt it land against her like a physical thing, a hand pressed flat against her chest. Because there it was, the exact weapon Quill had warned her of, pulled out and aimed in front of the whole county, dressed up in the language of fairness, so that nobody in that room would have to admit out loud what it actually was. Dodd looked at the deed, then at Bryda, real regret, moving across his tired face, the look of a man who wanted to do right and had just been told, persuasively, that right and the woman in front of him might not, after all, be standing on the same side. "It's a hard thing," the chairman said heavily, "but Mr. Sedgwick's not entirely wrong about the difficulty. A paper's only as good as the hand that brings it, and the code does give us room to weigh that." A woman 2 rows back said, not quite under her breath, that it hardly seemed fair to hold a body's size against her word, and her neighbor shushed her, and Dodd's gavel tapped once, more out of habit than real irritation. "You have more than my word," Bryda said, and was on her feet before she'd fully decided to stand. Every eye in the room swung toward her, and the old familiar terror rose in her chest, the terror of being looked at, weighed, found wanting before she'd said a single word to earn the judgment. She stood inside it anyway, and did not sit back down. "You keep saying there's no heir," she said, her voice gathering as she spoke, steadying instead of shaking. "You built your whole case on it. Swore to it on paper because swearing was easier than asking. So ask now. Ask this room plain. Is there a living soul here with marrow blood in her veins?" And from the back of the crowded room, from the doorway where she'd waited on Quill's arrangement, for exactly this moment, Cora Fenn came walking up the center aisle, and the crowd fell back on either side to let her pass. "I am," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the silent room. "Talitha Marrow was my grandmother. Rowan Marrow was my great-grandfather. I was raised on the story of that spring in that wagon cabin before this man was ever born." She turned and fixed Corwin Vale with a look that carried a lifetime of iron behind it. "You swore there was no heir. Put your own name to it. Well, here I stand. Look at the heir you sold this county a lie about." The room had gone utterly still. Sedgwick's mouth opened, some smooth objection already shaping on his lips, and it was into that stillness that Bryda reached into her satchel and drew out the last letter, the one she had not yet shown a living soul. "There's one thing more," she said. "A letter. Not from Ezra Marrow. From his son, Rowan himself. Written for whoever came after him. Built the way he was built, the way I am built." She held it up, let the whole room see the old, worn paper, the bold, unpracticed hand. "Mr. Sedgwick would have this board believe my size makes my word worth less. I'd ask the board instead to hear the word of a man who lived his whole life exactly as I've lived mine, and see whether it sounds any less true for the body that wrote it." She read it aloud, every word, her own voice steady, carrying to the very back wall of that crowded room. "If you are reading this, and are built the way I am built, then I want you to know something nobody ever once thought to tell me. You did not arrive wrong. Whatever this world has told you, she heard somewhere behind her, a woman in the crowd begin to weep quietly, for reasons that had nothing at all to do with land or deeds or county boards. She kept reading anyway, because Rowan Marrow had waited 40 years for somebody to carry these words into a room exactly like this one, and she was not about to stop halfway through the carrying. Whoever you are, however you got here, you are welcome in this house. She let the last line sit in the silence a moment before she lowered the page. Nobody in that room moved. Even Sedgwick, whose whole trade was built on knowing exactly when to speak next, had gone quiet, his half-formed objection dying somewhere behind his teeth. Dodd set the assessor's certificate down when she'd finished, slow as though it had soiled his fingers. "This certificate swears there's no heir of record," he said, and his voice had gone flat, dangerous. "And here stands a granddaughter of the blood, in my own meeting room with her family's letters in her hand, and a woman beside her the family themselves would have called kin on sight, judging by what I've just heard read aloud. I'd like to know how your assessor missed all that, Mr. Vale. I expect before this is finished I will." Vale's lawyer rose, some final smooth argument already forming, and it died half-shaped on his lips, because the room had turned, decisively, and he felt it turn, and there was no poured cream voice left in the world that could turn it back. Corwin Vale rose himself, buttoning his coat with hands that were, Bryda noted with some private satisfaction, no longer quite steady. "This board," he said, "is not competent to weigh questions of forgery. I'll take the matter to territorial court where—" "You'll take nothing anywhere just yet," Dodd said, and nodded toward the back of the room, where the county sheriff had been standing, arms folded, listening to every word of it. A woman sworn her family's ground was stolen by fraud, and a false certificate's been entered into this county's own records. That's not a thing a man simply walks away from because he'd rather be elsewhere. Dallin Vale, who had slipped in partway through the proceedings and taken a seat near the back, was already gone by the time the sheriff crossed the room, out the side door, and, by all accounts Bryda ever heard, afterward, out of the territory entirely within the week, leaving his brother to answer for both their sins alone. Bogue lasted a month longer, hiring himself out to a mining outfit 2 territories over before word of the flood caught up with him too. Corwin Vale stayed, not by choice. Justice, once it finally got moving, ground forward slow and thorough through the rest of that winter. The territorial court took up the matter, and Vale's lawyer bought every delay a clever man could purchase, but the deed held, and the assessor, facing a charge of false swearing that could cost him a great deal more than his post, discovered a sudden convenient memory of exactly which fee Corwin Vale had pressed into his hand to look no further than instructed. Once one man spoke, the rest came apart, fast investigators turning up the same theft dressed in different clothes across 4 counties, a widow's claim, a burned trapper's cabin, a family's papers vanished in a courthouse fire nobody could ever quite explain. The Iron Vein claim, which Vale had believed the easiest of his thefts, ground with nobody left alive to defend it, turned out to be the one loose thread that unraveled the whole quiet system he'd built his fortune on. None of that had happened yet on the afternoon of the hearing itself. That afternoon, once the crowd had finally thinned and the cold air had a chance to reach them both, Cora Fenn took Bryda's arm, reaching up considerably to do it, and did not let go for a long moment. "I have spent my whole life," Cora said, "not knowing why my grandmother cried every year on a certain day in October, same as clockwork. Happy tears, she always said, though I never once understood the tears that came with that much salt in them. I understand it now. I'm sorry it took a courtroom to explain it to you. Don't be sorry. I'd rather learn it loud, in a room full of witnesses, than never learn it at all." Cora squeezed her arm once, firm. "You're coming to supper before you go back up that mountain. That's not a request, in case the shape of my voice left it unclear. It didn't. Good. Then we understand each other already, which is more than most family manages inside the first year." Bryda laughed a real laugh, not the broken, unpracticed kind she'd startled herself with in the cabin 2 nights before, and found, walking back down Kettle Street with a woman who'd known her exactly 1 full day and had already claimed her twice over as kin, that the laugh came considerably easier than it ever had before. That supper turned into a standing one, most weeks, straight through the slow grinding of the court's business, and by the time the last of the snow finally gave way to mud season, Cora Fenn came to find Bryda in the room she still rented above the laundry. and sat down on the edge of a cot too short for the woman it belonged to, and took Brida's needle-scared hands into her own. "There's a cabin up on that mountain," she said, "that my great-grandfather built to last 100 years, and it stood empty most of them because there was nobody left who fit inside it comfortable. Josiah and I are settled where we are, too old and too fond of level ground to start over in a hollow that high." Her thumbs moved over Brida's calloused knuckles. "But it wants somebody in it. Somebody who knows exactly what a door like that is worth." Brida could not for a long moment find a single word to answer with. "I'm not offering charity," Cora said, before the silence could turn into anything Brida might mistake for pity. "I'm offering kin. My grandmother would have known you the second she laid eyes on you, and set a place at her table without asking a single question first. I'm asking you to be family," Brida called her. "Not out of what you're owed. Out of what you've already proven you are." She moved up to the hollow before the last snow properly cleared, and spent that whole first spring setting the old cabin back to rights, patching the roof, clearing the spring behind it, which still ran cold and sweet, and had never once, in all these years, frozen solid. She hung her own coat on the peg beside the one Rowan had left behind, and found, standing between them, that the two fit the same rack exactly, as if the man who'd built it had always known there would eventually be two coats there instead of one. She kept the carved words above the stove exactly as she'd found them. "Keep the low draft open in a storm or she'll smoke and choke you." She did not need the instruction anymore. Not really, her hands had long since learned every habit that cabin demanded of a person. But she left the words carved into the wood regardless, because some things earn the right to stay even after their usefulness has passed, and because she liked, some evenings, kneeling to feed the fire, to run her fingers over letters cut by a hand that had never once met her and had built for her anyway. She kept mending. That never changed. Word traveled, the way word does, that there was a woman up in the Iron Vein Hollow who could join together anything that had come apart: coats, harnesses, chair legs, the occasional wounded pride of a man too proud to admit how badly he'd torn his good shirt, and people rode up from 3 counties over now, not to stare, but to bring their broken things and leave again with something whole in their hands, and no need to leave quick about it afterward. Reverend Pruitt rode up once that first summer, on some pretext about checking the parish rolls for accuracy, and stayed the better part of an afternoon drinking coffee by the spring, and told her, before he left, that he'd never once in 11 years of keeping that register felt as glad about an entry in it as he felt about hers. On the 17th of October, the following year, Brida climbed to the little rise behind the cabin, where the spring ran loudest, and sat a long while listening to water that had never once frozen, not in 50 years, not for anybody. She did not weep. The feeling in her chest that day was too large and too settled for weeping. She had brought a small cake up the mountain with her that morning, wrapped in a cloth against the cold. Nothing grand. Flour and honey and a careful hour's patience, because she had read enough of Ezra Merrow's letters by now to know exactly what small, deliberate kindnesses had once meant in this hollow. And she had decided, without quite deciding it out loud, that some traditions were worth carrying forward even for an audience of one. She set it on the flat stone beside the spring. Lit no candle, the wind-up here would only have argued with it, and ate it slow, listening to water that had outlasted every winter anyone had ever thrown against it. She thought instead of a boy who had asked his father why God had built him this way, and never once gotten an answer that satisfied him. She thought she had an answer now, of a kind, not one she could carve into any wall, not one that would have satisfied that boy at 9 years old any more than his father's had, but an answer all the same. The world did not owe her an explanation for the size it had made her. It only owed her a door, and somewhere 40 years before she was ever born, 2 people who loved a son the world refused to make room for had built one anyway, wide enough, tall enough, patient enough to wait an entire lifetime for exactly the right stranger to come stumbling in out of a storm, and finally, walk through it standing fully upright. She was that stranger. She had been all along. And for the first time in 22 years, on the one day that had always belonged to nobody but the wide, indifferent mountains, Brida Calder was exactly where she belonged, and knew it, and was not afraid.